Well, good afternoon. Happy Wednesday again. I am so excited that you have joined me for Dear Grant Thunder Part 2. Don't forget the zip codes that matter. And I am Shanquetta Cunningham, CEO and lead strategist of Cares Group Consulting. And it is my absolute pleasure, honor, and I always say I get to do what I love and call it work to serve nonprofits, communities, uh, government institutions, any and everyone that says we understand that information and impact goes a long way to produce great outcomes in our communities and want to ensure that we leave our communities better, not just for us to live, but for the next generations. And so it's your favorite nonprofit strategist and bridge builder. And today we are continuing uh, Dear Grant Funder Part 2. And today we're going to talk about how do we leverage conversation that is not a finger pointing or this blame game of truly working together. And it started just from a conversation, as I shared in part one. And that conversation was with a grant funder who is excited and they're really trying to understand how do we work with micro small nonprofit organizations, rural nonprofit organizations, and that's not just by in the southern region, but truly organizations that are on the in the areas of communities to where it's not populated heavily with individuals, but the impact is so great. And so I am thankful that you all are joining me again for part two. And if you have not watched part one, after this video, I'm going to encourage you to do that because we're going to continue this series and conversation of Dear Grant Funders. So last week in part one, we talked about why rural and smaller nonprofits are often left out of major funding conversations. There is this idea that you have to be based in a large city, serving the masses to be considered for big opportunities, or that you have a certain amount of intelligence or authority to be able to execute exemplary programming. And so we started unpacking that in last week's conversation. But I do want to just emphasize this again. Impact isn't measured only by the size of the crowd, it's measured by the transformation in the people. And whether that is done with 1,000 inner city kids in Chicago or 150 in a rural county in Arkansas, the transformation is the impact and how that will lend itself to that child presently, but 20 years later, how will we see that impact show up in their lives? So for part two, today I want to talk about something that if we all are not careful, and that is going on the idea of assuming people know and how assumptions can hinder work from a grant funder's perspective, but also from the nonprofit perspective. As a nonprofit consultant, but also a nonprofit founder, I too have found myself thinking that, sometimes we think that funders already know what we're facing, that they are already abreast with all the data and knowledge of impact and the stresses or the situations or the culture or the community context of a nonprofit, and especially in rural areas or smaller nonprofits. We assume that corporate foundations, government partners, and philanthropic institutions are fully aware of what's happening in our zip codes, our boardrooms, and behind the scenes. But what if they're not? So if we can be real, most funders uh, and that we're looking to, they're not cash strapped. They often have small, streamlined teams and aren't directly responsible for implementing day-to-day outreach or solving crises in real time as nonprofit organizations. But they do have missions. They do need impact stories. And many of them are seeking ways to deploy capital responsibly, equitably, and effectively. But if we assume that grant funders know what we need, if we assume that grant funders, representatives, our leaders know what we need, we assume we can assume wrong, or it could be misguided. And it presents a missed opportunity to educate, empower, and expose those gaps. One of my greatest concerns as a consultant, working in this role and capacity, over the years, you see so much. You go into this space in the philanthropic sector with one idea, and every day I find myself learning and relearning and unlearning. And so, as a strategist, as a nonprofit founder, I'm learning this, that we need actual conversations between funders and nonprofits. And maybe this is not a fancy way, a fancy conference, but a true on the ground. We're rolling up our sleeves and we're both ready to listen, not in the form of presentations, not another application, but serious, real talk conversations. Why? Because while some nonprofits are thriving, and in rural areas or communities with smaller populations, or in those what I call the forgotten states at times, Arkansas, Idaho, right? Iowa, all of these smaller, impactful, mighty states. And there are some nonprofits, and there are nonprofits in these states and in the smaller areas that are thriving. They have strong operational support, program staff, and funding developers. Then there are others, and way too many, that are barely staying afloat. And that's not a coincidence either. There's been this shift over the last decade and move to fund programs, but then not the people that run them. And this has hurt so many rural and micro, small nonprofits more than we care to acknowledge. That how can we have sustained program excellence without the people that run them? I'm not saying every organization and every funder should prioritize ensuring that nonprofits are able to have 10 to 15 people on staff. But I do know these key positions of having an executive director, a program implementer, a development or outreach coordinator, these positions are essential to a nonprofit of any size. And that's how we can begin to build real capacity. And that's what creates transformation. So here's some things that I just believe nonprofit founders should know. I think this is how we shift the lens, that if we really and truly want transformation in our communities, we have to be willing to disrupt traditional systems. And I know sometimes you hear the word disrupt and, jaws start clenching and all of these things, but disruption is not a bad thing. As a mother of five, trust me, I know how disruption to your body. On the other side, though, the blessing, the beauty that awaits. Because sometimes tension is needed for progress. And so if we have that in mind, that there is something good on the other side, then can we take a moment to ask ourselves this old adage I've heard since I was 8 years old: if we always do what we've always done, we'll always get what we've already got. And I don't know if I think you're like me, if you're a grant funder that's listening, there's more, there's greater. There are communities that are in need, and you're trying to figure out how do we deploy the right resources? What is the right mechanism, the strategy, the patience, the hand-holding, the listening ears that we need to ensure that we see the progress that we want to fund, and nonprofits have the tools that they need to ensure the progress is implemented. Again, if you're just tuning in, I'm Shanquetta Cunningham of Cares Group Consulting, and we are on, part two of Dear Grant Funders. Really wanting to have, an open conversation uh, from me to you, to your heart as funders, nonprofit leaders, that how do we support and grow rural nonprofits, smaller nonprofits, micro nonprofits, so whether that's in the South, in the upper Northeast, Eastern states, in countries, around the world, how do we do this? And so I'm hoping this conversation sparks, some dialogue, needed dialogue, but also sharing this out loud so that you know that you have a partner as a consultant with myself that's willing to not just have the conversation, but then carry this forward. So I appreciate it if you like, tag, and share this video, and we're going to get back to it. So as it stands, rural philanthropy isn't always seen with the same hope or expectancy as urban philanthropy. That's a whole conversation within itself. And herein lies the issue. It sometimes, can be believed falsely that if an organization in Detroit, Michigan has a greater understanding, capacity, and grip on things because they have a larger volume to work with, than the small county and the small nonprofit that's in the state of Mississippi. When we seed into rural organizations, this is what I know to be true. You're investing in so much potential, in history, in community tools, and in particular, emphasis, because I live in the southern part of the United States. In the South, if we can be quite honest, it was the Southern economy that was built on the backs of Black labor under slavery. That exploitation fueled America's economic rise. And now many of those very communities have been abandoned and disinvested. That's not okay. And I think, again, that honesty needs to be shared. So, how do we help these areas that have once given all, literally everything, for a nation to be great? I have three practical shifts and solutions that I believe would add value to this conversation for connection, for continual impact, and for extended impact. Now, this sounds easy in these 25 minutes I'll be with you, all right? It will take us rolling up our sleeves and hitting the ground. It takes work, but can it be done? And I think we're at a pivotal time in our history, in our political framework, to truly disrupt systems that will continue to have people in cyclical ways of and means of getting by. And I believe funders and organizations both want the same thing. So, number one, I think it's important that we shift from transactional to relational grant making. I think it's time that we move beyond the checklist and assumptions. That I think I do know. Now, I do recognize that there are framework systems and evaluation methods of effectiveness that funders absolutely must adhere to and to have within themselves. Definitely agree and support. I think also it's important to have an openness to what that framework looks like when you're working with smaller entities. Site visits and conversations are also key in this transactional relationship in grant making. And I'm not just speaking about to current grantees. I am speaking of discovering what's happening across the philanthropic field in your entire region, the area, your geographic scope, and the areas to which you serve. Sometimes funders only engage with nonprofits after an application hits their desk. or the portal. But what if a scheduled Zoom call was fostered, or picking up the phone or visiting a nonprofit that hasn't even applied, but you simply heard about the good things before a proposal even comes in? That's relationship building. It's about connecting with organizations that are doing the work, but may also be timid and recognize they don't have those checklist points scratched off. But with a stretch and what capacity building looks like, they can absolutely be the organization that you'll be proud to fund if they had the help. Boots on the ground, even virtually, allows you to see who's emerging, who's rising, and where new investments could truly change the game. So that's part one. We can shift that and move beyond the checklist and assumptions to relational grant making. And many nonprofit funders are actually doing this work. And I definitely know a great consultant who can help you expedite this. Point number two, we say it all the time, but I think it's so important that we invest in people, not just projects. Programs don't run themselves. And I shared and alluded to this earlier. People do. And yet, over the past decade, plus, we've seen a shift toward funding only programmatic elements while overlooking the people that's required to execute the programs. General operating support isn't a luxury, it's a necessity. I'm not saying, again, that we have to overboard and overload organizations now with the staff and that we only fund positions. I am saying that I think it's time to revisit that pathway from personnel to programs and see the dire connection and vital components that you need people to have effective programming. And here's on the other side of this, that it's hard for nonprofit organizations, even in their missions and their outreach, to share with the community, well, we have funding for the program, but we're asking in fundraising for you to fund a position. That's not an attractive fundraising catch either. So I think it's a great time to figure out where did that standard begin, and how can we begin just, taking off some of those layers so that we can truly extend capacity. And then point number three, let's redefine what capacity building looks like. There are some people that truly, because capacity building has become such a catchword, I don't even know how many people have actually studied where that has come from, and not to diminish or to degrade anyone. But I'm asking you, as a nonprofit leader, a governmental representative, grant funder, do we ourselves understand the full scope of capacity, and ensuring capacity isn't executed in the system that favors a certain majority? Because unfortunately, that's what it has been. Capacity isn't just about upgrading software or staff size or big budgets. It's about systems and leadership development, and the freedom to innovate and tailor to the need of the nonprofit that you want to partner with. Too often, there's unspoken assumption that smaller nonprofits mean a lower level of capacity, or that rural means unprepared. But I think we should flip that. And not I think, I know. We're living in times where one small organized group can shift and has shifted the direction, the platform of an entire political party. We're witnessing that. So if we see on a large scale every day what one small ideology can do to an entire party, then how do we limit smaller nonprofits with their capacity and capability to shift the philanthropic culture and change the trajectory of outcomes in their very own communities? Small, micro, rural doesn't mean inadequate, incompetence, unintelligent. In fact, when you go into small communities, you will actually get a sense of cultural intelligence, great historical context, or traditions and stories, lived experiences that are incomparable. But we do need to ensure that both sides have the understanding of both sides. So to grant funders, I think an increased trust is necessary. To nonprofit leaders, I think an increased trust is necessary. To trust yourselves, trust your partners, and know that both, my pastor always says this, that we're all in the same room, and that's room for improvement. So it's time to grow and to stretch and ask for the support of what you don't know as a grant funder. And then also as a nonprofit leader, what you're willing to learn. None of us are too experienced, too educated, too wealthy, too connected, too established to learn, to unlearn, to relearn. That's capacity too. So as I conclude today's part 2 of Dear Grant Funder, I know that I pray that this conversation is more of some key reflective moments. What is the real innovation that we're all looking for? That will truly disrupt traditions that no longer serve us? What if transformation starts when we honor that any nonprofit that has decided to choose impact over income, any nonprofit that is willing to tackle problems that they may not even see truly transformed or eradicated in a quick amount of time, but they're willing to stay in the fight. What would happen if we are willing to truly increase capacity and investment into people that have heart, and that grant funders can do what they can to ensure that their heart becomes a great blueprint to receive greater, to help redefine some systems, to give some financial infrastructure. And if you're looking for the consultant and partner to help you with this, I want to want to be a bridge for that. I know that it's the calling of Charis to be in this space, to leverage information, and to also roll up my sleeves, sit at these tables, and to facilitate conversations, this design strategy, and inspire transformation in the organization, and to ensure that also your metrics are met to as a funder. So in part 2 of today's Dear Grant Funder, I hope that you see that there is so much value when we create systems or we're willing to discuss them that are simply not responsive, that are responsive and not reactive, that we're not just trying to fund organizations, but we're trying to truly create sustainable partnerships, and that we're truly better when we build communities together. So since 2014, I've helped nonprofits grow with confidence, strategic clarity, and trained hundreds of leaders. And this work never gets old. And so it is time that we continue this journey together in a more expanded way. So I'm 3 minutes over my own personal time I set. And so I thank you so much for joining me today for part 2 of Dear Grant Funder. We're going to keep the conversation going on next week for part 3. Again, please share this video with your favorite grant funder, your fellow nonprofit leader, your team. One of the things I always encourage nonprofit leaders when we attend events or I'm facilitating workshops is that the more information that you know and do not share, it's hurting your own nonprofit growth. What you know, you should teach or ensure that this is reached to your team. And also, before you go, on July 29th, we are hosting Should I Start a Business or Nonprofit? That workshop again on July 29th at 6 p.m. registration is open. So if you know of individuals who are in that questionable phase of, do I go for the business venture or should I start a nonprofit? And if I do start either, what are the steps? And if I'm still in this phase of confusion, how do I move forward with clarity? Well, this workshop is definitely for those individuals or for you if you are a nonprofit uh, leader and you want to now have a for-profit venture or vice versa. So I thank you all for joining. Again, that is July 29th at 6 p.m. And that link should be in the chat soon. Thank you so much. This is Shanquetta Cunningham, and I will see you next week for part 3 of Dear Grant Funders. You all have a blessed afternoon.